that are here. We are recording so that you can access this afterwards if you want to go back and check anything or rehear something or re-find the link of things that we've talked about. You'll have access to that, as well as we know some folks life's in session and so they just can't actually make the time. So we want to try to make that available for others that were interested. So we'll wait one last minute. There is a shared resource document that we will be using. This will be we will be interacting with one another through this. So we encourage everyone to participate from where they are in whatever capacity. But this is not a just sort of sit and get talked at for an hour, because I don't really enjoy that. So I try to make this a bit more interactive so that you can walk away with things to use and think about the things that we're talking about in this next hour that we have together. And I see lots of anonymous animals popping up, so that means like, whew, I got the Google settings right in terms of access. That's always something I'm scared about when I share out Google documents. It's such a blessing and also such a challenge. Excellent. Okay, so welcome. Today we're going to be talking not another bar chart, teaching graph choice with Data Classroom. This is a collaborative workshop that we're putting on, sponsored by Data Classroom. So excited to be here and to talk with all of you. We're going to be thinking about sort of what does it mean to help our students and our learners with this skill of graph choice, and how the tools that Data Classroom has are really positioned well to help with us. So we're going to be going kind of back and forth on like, what's the general, and then how do we sort of leverage some of these smaller pieces or key components that drive what Data Classroom is to help our students get at that key skill. So create a free account. Everybody can create a free account and you can have access to everything that we'll be talking about over the next hour. And I highly encourage you to ask questions and to put those in the chat. Erin Reedy, the co-founder of Data Classroom, is here with us today. Super exciting to answer all of your questions that are Data Classroom and about accounts and things like that. So his expertise is in that space. I am super excited to talk to you about data skills. Specifically, we're going to be thinking about how does graph type influence what we can interpret from our data, as sort of a thought-provoking like, okay, let me think about then how that relates to the kinds of graphs that my students are looking at in our curriculum, whatever curriculum it is that you are using. We'll think about how do we teach, or how do we know what graph type we should use when we are graphing our own data, and how we can get at that from two different angles. And then also, how can we potentially make our graphs differently? How can we think about this graph choice from a different angle? So let's dive right in. And as I said, this is not just a sort of sit back and listen. I really want you guys to participate and, tell me sort of what are you looking to get out of this? So in the chat, if you could drop in, what are you hoping to gain from this session? Life is crazy. It's totally in session right now, and you have opted to take an hour out of your very busy schedules to come join Erin and I to talk about this topic of graph choice and getting our students to make more than just bar charts. So what are you hoping to gain? And the best of my ability, I will try to address that in the next hour. And if not, I will post the resources in the shared resource document that we have that we're working off of together if I can't get to it in the next hour. So I'm going to stop talking so you can post these in the chat. Okay, don't worry. Even if you don't have computers with your students, you can still get something from this. We're looking for new data sets. Awesome. Fantastic. Penny and Scott, thanks for sharing. Other things that folks are hoping to gain from this? Great. We've got some high school teachers here looking to gain ideas how to better prepare their students, some examples of how to incorporate graphing in. This is fantastic. Super helpful. Thanks for dropping those in. So why graphs? Before, I encourage you all to participate openly, fully, inclusively for yourself and for others. Some of this might be review, some of this you might be hearing something you already know, but from a different angle, and some of you this might be new. And I say all are welcome, and just lean into whatever space you're in terms of like what you can get out of this and how and what it's resonating. If it's not resonating, then just leave it and try to find something else that does resonate. We all teach in different situations. We have different learning circumstances that we facilitate learning within. And so I just encourage us to use our I statements rather than sort of generic statements to acknowledge those differences and similarities that we have. So why graph choice? Why data? Why are we doing this? Well, I could show and read you this of exit this room by walking towards the living room, walk straight 6 feet and turn right, walk straight another 10 feet to the front hall and turn left. And I have to say, I am already bored and I have lost track of what the first thing is that I was supposed to be doing. Whereas if I were to show you this, then you could more quickly get to what is it I'm trying to tell you? What is it that you are going for, or that I am going for into trying to teach you this? We are, those of us that are visually able, are remarkably visually oriented. It's something on the order of we take in somewhere between 10 and 50 million visual stimulus at a time. We acknowledge and sort of recognize about 50 of those, and we remember 2 to 3 in any given second. So there's lots of information coming towards us, and we can leverage that to our advantage, which is why graphs hold such a great space for us. Oh. So the definition that I use for data literacy is it's the ability to collect, organize, visualize, analyze, interpret, and share data for yourself and other people to use and understand. And if you're thinking, Kristen, that is insane, that's a really broad definition, then yes, I will say it is, because we tackle this across the K to gray spectrum. We tackle a lot of the skill building in the K to 12 to prepare our students to go out into the world to work with data. This is not something we can do in one lesson or one activity. It is not all on you to accomplish in the 1 year or 2 years or 3 years if you loop with your students that you're with your students. This is a big thing. This is like literacy and numeracy for the reality of our 21st century. Okay, so let's start with some context setting on graph type and how it influences what we can interpret. So don't respond yet. We're going to do this as a waterfall. So I'm going to give you guys all 45 seconds to just look at this graph. I'll orient you to it first. And what I want you to think about are, and type in the chat, what are some things that you notice? And what do you wonder when looking at this graph? So what is this graph that you're looking at? Well, it's a graph that was put out on May 10th of 2020. So a really different time in our country in terms of this. I should have given up the warning sign. We are looking at COVID case counts, but this is from 2 years ago. This was a graph that was put out by the Georgia Department of Public Health to indicate the 5 most impacted counties in Georgia. I don't know if we have any folks in the house tonight that are from Georgia. If so, rock on. You would know where these 5 counties are. I am not from Georgia, but these 5 counties are generally around the Atlanta, Georgia area. For those of us that don't live in the state, it's actually irrelevant to figure out what we notice and what we wonder, but just as some context setting of what we're looking at. So it was of these 5 counties in Georgia, over the last 15 days, how have the number of case counts, what have the number of case counts looked like? Okay, now I'm gonna stop talking and I'm gonna ask you to think about what do you notice and what do you wonder? And we will post them in the chat once I say go, but don't post them yet because I wanna give us all time to sort of take in and look at and make sense of this graph. Okay, so we're getting towards the end. Should be typing out some of our thoughts of what do you notice? What do you wonder? And when you're ready, you can start posting them in the chat. Okay, great. We've got folks noticing a negative trend over 15 days, wondering how did they go down so quickly? We have folks noticing the dates don't go in order and wondering why that might be. We have folks thinking, sort of focusing in on specific counties, like Fulton is in yellow, and what might be happening. This graph is a real gem. The county order changes each day. Awesome. These are great things to be noticing and wondering. All of them, all of the things that you all noticed and wondered are all wrapped into why I use this graph. In the resource document, there's a link if you want to find out more about this graph. I am not interested in talking about this graph and where it came from, but I want to use this as an example of when the vast majority of us first look at this graph, the vast majority of adults first look at this graph, we see a decreasing trend in case counts over the last 15 days. And that is because we live time chronologically. So we do not look at the x-axis to see if the dates are in chronological order. We presume, given the title and the subtitle, that that is what we're going to be looking at. If we do look at the graphs, if we rearrange the dates in chronological order, these are what the data look like. Now, there are still fewer case counts here towards the 15 days part of the, like towards the end of those 15 days, but it's not as precipitous as it felt in this first graph. So I share this to say how we graph our data influences what we can interpret. And that's the goal of having our learners work with data and make sense of data, is to interpret something from it, to figure out what the data are telling us. The order of the counties do vary by day. Sorry, I'm jumping back and forth. The way that they are originally ordered is in descending order from each day. Now, neither of these things, the dates not being a chronological order or the counties not being consistent across each day, is necessarily a bad thing. There may be a reason why you would want to break that convention. The problem is the graph was presented as to be able to compare across counties across 15 days. So there was a disconnect there between what we were expecting and what we actually saw. Now, the other thing is we have lived this for the last 2 years, and we know intuitively now that our case counts on one day are related in some way to our case counts the previous day. So, and time, no matter what we're looking at, is an ordinal variable. And so maybe bar charts that indicate discreteness aren't actually the way that we should be looking at the data. Maybe a line chart would be a better way to look at the data to give us a sense of trends and how we could compare across these counties. So again, sort of the how we graph our data influences what we can interpret from the data. And this is why I think graph choice is a really important precursor skill, or sort of an introduction, like a entry in skill, if we are expecting analysis and interpretation on the back end when our students are working with data. Okay, that was a lot of me talking, so time for you guys to reflect again. What are the 3 most common graph types your students make? Post it in the chat. So when we ask our students to make graphs, when they are making their own graphs, what do they make? Line, bar, pie. Ooh, a Venn diagram. That one's super exciting. That one doesn't often show up. Awesome. We've got an XY scatter plot. We've got bar, we have line, we have bar, we have line, we have pie. Yes, 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 and yes. And this is how it goes with hundreds of thousands of teachers that I talk to. And this is how it went with my students when I was in the classroom. I used to teach middle school science. Our students have limited graph types that they often go to. The good old bar, the good old line chart. Now, these are not necessarily bad, and I could talk for like a whole other talk on why is that the case? Why are we drawn to some of these graph types? And it gets into like how our brains work and how our eyes work and what we know about all of that. That's a separate talk. Happy to geek out with you. My contact information's on the shared resource document if you want to talk about that. But when it comes to our students working with data, this sometimes creates tension because they just go to these limited graph types. Or they create these unconventional graph types. This, by the way, is a like nested bar chart where like the different categories are all nested within one another. And it makes it really hard to figure out like, what was the student thinking? What were they actually like? How are they trying to process the data? Now that student's a really interesting case because when we were able to follow up with them in an interview, this student had so much insight in the data. But on first look, I had no idea what was going on based on how they had graphed the data. So I do want to say that what we are talking about in terms of graph choice is relevant if you are having them graph by hand, if you are having them graph on a computer with a spreadsheet program, or if you are leveraging something like Data Classroom for them to make their graphs. This is kind of the overarching skill that we are working on here. And what research tells us when we ask students how they pick these graph types, it is usually what they are familiar with, what shows up first, or what they're told to do by the teacher, or what shows up first on a drop-down menu, or what looks the most complicated because they think their teacher is going to want that. And that's not good, right? That's not actually how we choose what graph types we should use. Goodness gracious, this is going to drive me crazy. Because there are quite a few common ways that we visualize data. What do I mean by this? How did I come up with this list? Well, I looked at what do our standards say our learners in K-12 should know how to do with data by the time they graduate high school. So based on our Common Core Math, our Next Generation Science standards, social studies standards across many states throughout our nation. But then I also found that there's a gap between what our standards say our students should be able to do with graphs and what we often see in our popular media. So Washington Post, Fox News, New York Times, USA Today. What are we commonly seeing? What are we commonly being exposed to on our watches, on our phones? What are the graphs that are showing up in front of us? Because in theory, if we are preparing our students to be citizens of our country by the time they graduate 12th grade, we gotta sort of get them ready for this. So these are the common graph types. If you're not familiar with some of these, don't worry, there's a resource in the shared resource document where you could look them up. I'm not testing you on your knowledge of different graph types today. The tricky thing is, and I was totally guilty of this with my students, is that oftentimes we teach our students how to make a pie chart, how to make the bar chart, but not when to use the pie chart or the bar chart. So that's what we're going to talk about. How do we flip this so that we're teaching our students when to use these different graph types so they really assist in our data analysis and interpretation, not just execute to get the graph done to move on to our CER with data. And there are three common types of questions that we ask in the K-12 space when it comes to working with data. This is not exhaustive. There are other questions that we ask, and there are certainly other questions that we ask of data out there for those that professionally look at data. But these are the three that most often come up. We're asking comparison questions. So we're comparing two or more groups. Are they the same? Are they different? Pre-treatment, like the treatment versus the control. Was there a difference? Are they correlated? Is there a relationship? We ask distribution questions. So we're looking at the variability of a group. Like, how tall are fourth graders? How much does the height vary? This is something that our students actually intuitively know, and then it creates this like big sort of like disconnect when we come to doing it with data. Or we ask composition questions, where we're looking at how is the total proportioned into subgroups. I don't know about you, but my students certainly could not tell me what type of question they were asking, my middle school students, nor can my undergrads at Rutgers who I teach data visualization and science communication to. But what they can do with some prodding and some like scaffolding on my part is they can talk about their data. So I can get them talking about, okay, well, before we put the plants into, before we added the fertilizer, we expected this. And then after we added the fertilizer, we expect that. Great. That's a before after. So we're looking at a comparison. So we can use some of these describing words. Please add more that resonate with you to sort of cue in for us to think about when we're listening to them talk, or for them to listen to each other, that peer-to-peer or small group, getting them to work it out together actively, to think about, okay, what type of question am I asking? Okay, but you might be thinking, but how does this relate to the kinds of graphs that we would use? Because there's certain visualization types, certain graph types that we use to answer these different questions. And so we can help our students, we can help our learners create kind of not just a, well, what am I going to pick from the drop-down menu, or not be so reliant upon us to tell them what type of graph type to make. We can give them a visual cue of, if you're asking a comparison type question, these are the kinds of questions, these are the types of graph types that you might want to use. Now, it can go down a next level. We could narrow it down a little bit more. Are we asking a comparison among different items or among categories within a variable or an attribute? Are we looking between attributes or between variables, depending on which subject area you teach in? So we can drill down a little bit farther. And now we can start to build, sort of building that muscle into graph choice. And you are going to practice this a little bit. So I encourage you to go to this website to make a copy of the Google Slide document. It is also, if you're following along in our shared resource document, the link is right here. So you can click right onto it. You can make a copy. So when you click on it, I should have had this open, but thanks for rolling with me as I play along. So you're going to want to make your copy. And what you will be able to do is you'll land on a page like this. What I just showed you in terms of the question types and the describing words is on slide 2. So if you'd like that as a reference, that is there for you. On this first page, it's a little hard to see, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit. On this first page, I have different tiles that you can drag and drop in, and I'm just randomly dragging and dropping these at the moment, to think about, of those common graph types that I showed you, that in general our students should be able to look at and make sense of when they graduate 12th grade. Where would they fall? What kind of question would we ask to use that type of graph type? Okay, so I'm going to stop talking so that you guys can make a copy of this slide, this Google slide, and do a little bit of your own sort of playing around and thinking about which of these graph types go with these three common questions that I've been talking about. So I'll go back here so you can see the graph, the URL. Again, it's in our shared resource document as well, and I will put it in the chat for those that haven't gotten access to the shared resource document. Thank you, Robin, for also posting a link. Okay, and let's take about 2-3 minutes to play around a little bit.
What was the question again?
The question is, can you create sort of your own key? Can you take these different tiles of the different graph types and drag them around to figure out, okay, this type of graph we would use to answer this type of question? Does that help? Yes, Supreet, I will share the resource document with you. Just 1 second. Thank you for asking. Just had to find the link. There you go. Okay, great. So hopefully folks have been able to get in, make a copy of the document, and think about kind of these different graph types, what kinds of questions would we think about using that graph type to help us ask those types of questions from our data. So what Erin's trying to do now is to see if we can create some breakout rooms of sort of 2 to 3 of you in a breakout room. And what I encourage you to do in the breakout room is to talk with each other about this process, about thinking about these common graph types as it relates to the kinds of questions that those graph types help us answer. We're not here to talk about the graph types or test anybody's knowledge of the different graph types, but really trying to think of like this process, this sort of structure that I have given you. And I will share in a moment, once we come back from the breakout rooms, what I would say is sort of an approach that we could take to putting together these graph types. Erin, are we ready to go?
We are not ready to go. I've made you a co-host here. Can you go ahead and start the breakout rooms?
Oh, no, I can. Yes, I totally can. Okay.
Sorry about that. I wasn't ready on the fly.
No, it's totally fine. I threw that at you pretty last minute. Okay, so we're talking with one another about the kind of this structure of thinking about graph types as it relates to what kind of question that we would use those graph types to help us answer. And we'll spend about 5 minutes in the breakout rooms, and then we'll come back together and discuss out as a full group. Enjoy. So some of you might be wondering, those of you that have not looked ahead in the slide deck, sort of what might this look like if I had given you more time? I gave you a very short amount of time to do this. But what I think is actually more interesting than this is if we align it with those question types and those describing words. And so this is what I was talking about. When we have a resource like this, our learners have a way to cue in to, okay, what if I'm asking this type of question, what type of graph type might I use to graph my data to help me answer that question? Because the graph type we use is always dependent. When we're actually looking at data to find meaning, it is dependent upon what are we asking and what kind of data that do we have. So this is what it looks like in terms of what our AP and upper IB students and our undergraduates should be able to do. They should be able to make all of these graph types. This is what it looks like in terms of our lower high school student, like our lower as in younger high school students. Like, what should they be able to make sense of? What should they be able to make? This is what it looks like for our middle school students, of where are they developmentally in their understanding of data as a representation and thinking about data when we're trying to answer a question. What are the graph types that they're working on and that they are wrestling with? And for any of you out there that teach in that middle school grade band, and if you just feel like they come to me and they know so little about what to do with data, this is what our elementary students are working on. Again, this does not mean that they cannot use other graph types to make sense of things, but this is developmentally kind of where they're at in their abstract and concrete thinking, their understanding of how things vary and thinking of things in an aggregate as a group, as opposed to individual cases of my favorite color is red. I am that dot on the pictograph of my favorite color. So we can use other graph types with our learners than what show up here. But this is sort of developmentally where our kids at in terms of graph types that they're sort of ready to really make sense of and dive into. One thing I do want to call out is that across all of these age levels of our learners, all three of these types of questions show up. They can and do ask questions across all three of these different types of questions. Now, how could we use a resource like this? Well, there are lots of teachers that I work with, and I actually do this in my first week with my course at Rutgers, where we create this themselves. So it's a student created, figure out what graphs would go and where, very similar to exactly what you did. This is a freely available resource. Please use it, have it if you would like, use it with your students. What I also do, and what a lot of the teachers that I work with also do, is that once they've created it, then it sort of goes in a notebook, or it goes up on the wall, or it goes someplace that students can use it as that visual cue as they're working with data. And what I love about this is that it gets at if we think about graph choice as kind of a skill, like a muscle that you need to strengthen, we can get at this from two different directions. So we can get at this when our students are graphing their own data. They can look at this and be like, okay, what type of question am I asking? Okay, so then what row am I on for the type of graph that I need to use? Now, they still need to make a choice of which graph type to choose. That's a key part. They are part of the choosing process. But we've at least narrowed it down to a row that's actually related to their question, as opposed to what looks shiny or what looks interesting or what's the thing that Google Sheets puts out for me or makes the suggestion of. None of those are great ways to choose our graphs. What I also love is that we can use this resource to flex the muscle from a different direction. So when we're looking at static graphs that somebody else put together, when those show up in our curriculum, or when they show up in our media or our current events that we're having our students look at, we can pause and have students think of, okay, what kind of question were they asking? Does it make sense that they picked this graph type? Does the graph type they're using actually line up with the question that they made? 9 times out of 10 it does, which is just reinforcing that those graph types go with those questions really well. And every once in a while, there's a big disconnect, which is a great teachable moment of why did they break the convention? Was it for a good reason? Did it work out okay? Or did this actually make it more complicated to figure out what they were figuring out from their data, which is also a great way to flex the muscle. So I think about it when we're trying to strengthen our arm muscles. I keep grabbing my arms. It's we do pull-ups, we do push-ups, we do bicep curls, we do tricep dips, all these different ways to strengthen that muscle. Graph types is one of those data skills that we gotta flex and strengthen from all different perspectives. So as I said, this is a freely available resource. Please go to the website, check it out, download it for whatever grade levels are appropriate for you, and check it out. Data Classroom has this built in to their tool to help students along the way when they are making sense of either their own data, Erin, correct me if I'm wrong, and also all of those fantastic data sets that Data Classroom has in there when they're making sense of those data. And I'm gonna hand over the screen sharing to Erin so he can show you in real time what that looks like. But before I do, I just wanna point out, so he's gonna show you kind of how to get to this graph wizard. And once he opens the graph wizard, it will show up. They have 5 categories that students can pick from in terms of what are they trying to do with the data, AKA, what kind of question are they asking? And there are 5, and you might notice that we were just talking about 3 questions. And so I put it here sort of a like, if we were to map these 5 categories to the 3 questions we were just talking about, what that would look like. Okay, Aaron, can you take it away and demo for us how we find that graph wizard?
Absolutely. Thanks for doing that alignment too, showing how your sort of framework maps on to what we've done. I thought that was really cool. Yeah, so let me share my screen and you can all see my screen. So this is the Data Classroom website, and on another tab, I am logged in to the app, and I've got one of my favorite demo data sets. So if some of you have done a one-on-one with me, you may have seen this before. This is cicada sex education. And these data come from cicada populations all across North America. And there's a number of questions you can ask with this. And that's one of the reasons I like to use it for a demo, because in any direction we go, we can ask just a wide variety of question types, because we have a couple of categorical variables and we have multiple numeric variables. So like Kristen pointed out in her slide, there is this flow chart up here, and this is meant to be a guide for working with your own data, or your students upload their own data. Any of our preloaded data sets in the app are going to have the preparation stage is done, as evidenced by the green check marks there, and you're ready to go on to graphing. And when you click this graphing button, it shows you how to just move to the graphing tab. If you are, if that's all you want to do, it shows you where that button is. But you can also open the graph wizard, and this opens up the image that Kristen showed you, where you're asking students what kind of question are they interested in. Is it one of proportions, or is it change over time? Is it variability? Is it comparing groups, or is it a relationship? And this is very similar to the structure that Kristen was using, just sort of a little bit more finer grained on these questions. With this data set, we could ask questions of proportions, like, how are the cicadas spread across the different species groups? How are they spread across samples that were male or female? We can ask questions about variability. What is the shape of the data or the distribution? We can ask questions about comparing groups. Is head width different between males and females, or is head width different among the 3 species groups? Or we can ask relationship questions, which are, how does altitude affect head width, where you're sort of looking for a relationship between numeric variables. To kind of show you how this works, I'm gonna do a question of comparing groups. So say the central question in this activity is, is there a difference in head width between males and females among these cicadas? So if I click yes on comparing groups, and then I'm moving forward with the next, and it will give me the opportunity to choose a variable type. So which variable specifies the group, and I can say, well, that is sex. And then which variable am I interested in? We'll say this is head width. And you can see if I were to choose, species group here, it would indicate that for this path, this variable must be numeric. And at this point, I can either change it, or I could back up, and go back to the beginning and go back down the path. But I'm just gonna quickly go forward in this. We'll compare sex, and we'll compare head width as the variable of interest here. And then we go forward, and it shows you, okay, here are 4 variations of graphs that you could make. And it's really 2 core variants here, and then 2 variations on each. And so one is this dot plot, and one is a histogram. And you can choose to show those with or without descriptive stats there. And so, like, let's take the histogram with descriptive stats. I click yes and move down that path. I can either bow out at this point. If I say, yep, that's all I needed to know, I already know how to press the buttons here, I'll do it myself. Or if you really are a novice and you're saying, show me the steps, you can go through, and it'll show you each click that's needed to make this graph in total is there. And I can go down them one at a time. I can also hit the do all at the bottom, and it will produce this graph. So here now I've got this histogram split out by sex. So we've got female in red, male in blue. And above that, we've got the default is to show mean and standard deviation, but we can play with this. This doesn't have to be the end here. We could do a median representation, like a box and whiskers, or we could even do, multiple representations at once above the graph. But that's basically how the graph choice chart works. It's very much that same concept that Kristen was talking about of what question are you trying to ask? And that determines, what your array of appropriate choices is for representing that. And the idea with this is that I hope that kids will use this in the beginning, and then eventually it will start to become tedious for them when they just say, you know what, I could just jump to this graphing window. And if I was, starting from scratch, I could make that graph, pretty quickly by doing that. And so there, I've made it with just a few clicks. And yeah, so that's basically how our graph wizard works.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I'm going to take it back. The
Go
screen
for it.
sharing. Excellent. So there's a tool, a strategy you can use by hand on your computer, however you're having your students look at graph, or it's baked in multiple different ways within Data Classroom to help students sort of wherever they're at to build that skill. I want to spend just a few minutes. I'm noticing we have time. We've got 12 minutes till the top of the hour. A few minutes thinking about this other perspective of kind of that graphing method. And Aaron was getting at this a little bit as he was clicking around. And for those familiar with Data Classroom, sort of the power that you can easily look at data. But we're going to kind of go through an activity together, where we're going to try to answer or try to think about the question, when do cherry trees blossom? So I'm currently in Princeton, New Jersey. This is something that those of us on the Eastern Seaboard often think about as Washington, D.C., the cherry trees in Washington and when they're in bloom and things like that. But there are cherry trees all over the world. We will be looking at data from Japan for their cherry trees. So what I'm going to ask you to do, this is a quick activity. I'm going to ask you to look at the data. And I should also say, this is an activity designed for you as adults. This is not necessarily designed to use tomorrow with your students, but please adapt it as you see fit for your learners and what they can handle if this resonates with you. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to show you the data in just a moment. I'd like you to look at it, thinking this is our question. When do cherry trees blossom? And then I want you to decide what kind of graph would you use to answer that question based on the data that I am providing you, based on the data that I'm showing you. And so when I say that, what kind of graph would you use? I mean, what type of graph, those graph types that we were just talking about, what variables would you plot where for this graph type that you selected? And which data would you use? Which of the variables would you look at? So I'm going to keep this up here, but I know for many of you, there might be sort of small screens. It is also on the top of page 3 in our shared resource document. So you can look at the data in both places. So again, I'm asking you to look at these data and think about, for the question, I should have put it here, for the question, when do cherry trees blossom? Which of these data would you use? And what kind of graph would you make from these data to answer that question? We'll take about 45 seconds. Actually, no, let's take a full minute to look at these data. We're not actually here to learn about cherry trees, but this is a fun data set. So let's take a minute, and then after a minute, I'll let you know, and you can post it in the chat. Graph type, variables, where were you using them, which variables you were using, and where you were thinking about putting them on a graph.
Kristen, we have a question in the chat. Is there a place to find your matrix of graphs for middle school students? That's in your slide, correct?
Yes, it is in my slide, and I will come back and show you exactly where you can find that once we finish this activity. So Robin, I see your question, and I'm going to circle back to you.
And I'll also add, we will create a website for this event, and we'll add it to the Data Classroom webpage, and then we'll email it all out to you, and it'll have the recording as well as the resources.
Okay, again, because we're not here to actually study cherry trees and I'm not giving you time. Hopefully you're not actually drawing out this graph with like scaling all the axes, but you know, a quick sketch of what the graph might look like is always good. It's a visual hypothesis. That's another great skill that a strategy we can use with our students to help them with data analysis and interpretation. But curious to hear, so again, sort of a waterfall style, everybody can type in and post in which of these variables were you thinking about using, and what kinds of graphs were you thinking about potentially using if I gave you more time to actually plot out these data in a graph to answer that question of when do cherry trees blossom? So when you've got a moment, you can drop it in the chat or you can unmute and share it out verbally if you would like. Okay, so Cheryl says, I'm thinking about a line because we're focused on change over time. So year on the x-axis, day in the year on the y-axis. Ooh, and I like it with a color to indicate a switch from pre to post industrialization. Wow, awesome. We've got so many things going on in there. Thanks for sharing, Cheryl. What about, let's hear from one other person. What were some other folks thinking about which variables to use or variable to use and what type of graph type that you would use? There's no right answer to this question. Nice. A line or a scatter with the date to see the trend. Awesome. So thank you very much, Penny, for sharing as well. This is what we often do as experts working with data. So there is a difference between our learners who are more novices of working with data and us as experts. Those of us that are more familiar with looking at data. And even if you do not subscribe as a data expert yourself, trust me, you are more of an expert than your learners, and your brain thinks differently about the data than your learners do. And one of the big things that we do as experts is what you guys highlighted when we were looking at that COVID case counts from Georgia at the beginning of the hour. We jump to the why. Why did it happen? What was going on? Why did those case counts drop so high? And in this example, what you guys have so beautifully demonstrated is we jump to thinking sort of in that why, how many different things can we pull together to think about this question? So my question was, when do cherry trees blossom? So the variable that I would use is the full flowering date, so the date of the year that the flowering happens. And these are all the data. It's just one variable, so we could get a sense of the range from day 128 of the year down to day 86 of the year, or like up to day 86 of the year. For those of you that don't think in day of the year, I'm sure there's an online calculator where your students could type in the day of the year and it could spit out, oh, that's March 13th or whatever it is. Don't quote me on that. That was just a random guess. One thing that I do like about Data Classroom, as Erin was showing you, is you can so quickly drop things on to the different axes to plot out the data, and you can look at them in different ways to get a sense of what's going on. So all of those ways that you guys were thinking about looking at it are fantastic. Like thinking about the date, adding color to get at it. Those are all great, but they all add other components to the question of when do cherry trees blossom? There's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes for our novices, helping them go back to that initial spot of first, let's look at what's the range of days in the year in which cherry trees blossom. And then we could go to think about, has that changed over time? So then we can start adding in, layering in those extra attributes, or as was shared out, we can, we can get a sense of, is that different from pre-industrial to post-industrial times? Things like that. But starting with sort of the fundamentals or the initial, let's look at one variable at a time and get a sense, can be really helpful. Okay, we're getting close to the top of the hour, and I just want to share out a few other things with you all before we go back to the rest of our lives. Data Classroom is I think has a lot of things that are really well baked in for helping students explore and understand the data. Aaron and his team are phenomenal. They make it all available to you for free for the first 90 days, and they are here to hear your questions and answer your questions, help you out, figure out how you can leverage this tool into your classroom. Google Sheets and Excel is what I used to use, and it's what most of the teachers that I work with use. And really, that's a like round peg square hole of it's a spreadsheet program that we make graphs out of. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. I've got a few final things that I want to leave you with before we drop off today. So one of them is we've talked a lot about graph type and how we can align our graph type with the type of question that we're asking. And I just want to share out that like, although a graph type can be more effective for the question we have, it doesn't mean that every other graph type is ineffective. So the choice has to come into this. What I also want to share is that getting our students to work with data and become comfortable with data, it takes time. So here's my soccer analogy. This is what my 6-year-old looks like when he plays soccer. I call it amoeba ball. You can tell where the ball is because all of the kids are around the ball. This looks really different than our US teams that played in the Olympics last summer. But we are not trying to get them to be professionals with data. We are trying to prepare them for the world, whether they go on to college or they're going into the workforce. We're trying to prepare them in that sense. And just like with soccer, we can stair step their way through in teaching these graph skills, in using different components of teaching different skills along the way. Because there's a lot that goes into making sense of data. And we've spent an entire hour talking about one component, like even just one aspect of one component, the visualizing data. So if you're interested in sort of thinking about this a little bit more and getting a sense of what could this look like for my classroom, there are a bunch of resources out there. There are awesome books that I could recommend of things if you want to dive in and help your students make more sense of data. Or we could, or I also have resources. I've shared some with you tonight. There are more resources that I could share out. Really what I'm interested in is making sure you all don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel or that you're so busy and drowning. I understand there's so much going on and you all are moving mountains with everything that you do every day, but we can help with some of these resources. So if you'd like some personalized strategies or access to more of these resources, you're like, this was great, Kristen, but there's something else that I need, then let me know. I've opened 6 spots in my calendar next week for you guys for a time-saving strategy call. It's totally for free. We can jump in, we can chat. I can hear about sort of what you're looking for, and I can direct you towards those resources to get you the help that you need. Hopefully you're all taking away something from the time that we've spent together today in this last hour. But if not, reach out. I'm happy to help. I encourage you as we all go back into the rest of our lives, if you could pause for just 30 seconds or a minute. These questions are in our shared resource document down here. We're not going to post them in the chat, but I encourage you to think personally and reflect on how have these activities prompted you to think differently about using data visualizations in your teaching or whatever work that you do with your learners around data? Or how could you expand how you use data visualizations or different aspects of the tools that Data Classroom provides to help your learners? So with that, I thank you so much for joining in for this hour. I thank Aaron for collaborating with me on this and sponsoring this webinar. If you have questions, I can stick around, but I want to be mindful of all of your time. I appreciate all of your participation, all the great questions and thoughts that you had. And I did remember, I forgot to point out how to find the graph matrix. So if you scroll down to the bottom, if you click on this link, you will get redirected to the page on my website where, moving a little slowly, you can scroll down and get a sense of, okay, so for the elementary, for the middle school, for the high school, all those different pieces. And it is set up as a Google Slide document that you can download and you could use to run that activity with your learners the way we modeled out here today. So thank you. Aaron, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you have any last words you'd like to say.
Sure. First, I just want to say thank you, Kristen. That was wonderful. I hope we can do some more of these again in the future. That was great. For everyone else, if you have any data classroom questions at all, you're interested in us talking with science coordinator or math coordinator at your school, you can feel free to drop me a line directly at aaron@dataclassroom.com, and I put that in the chat. I'd be happy to talk with you about all things data. Be happy to talk with you about really any question related to data or using Data Classroom at your school. So feel free to drop me a line. And with that, I guess I'll say thanks for coming. And I'll stop the recording now, but I also can hang out around a little bit. So if anyone has any questions, I too can hang out for 10 or 15 minutes.